In terms of the details of his life, we have very extensive information about where he was born, how he grew up, his childhood, how the prophecy first reached him, what he did after that, year after year, almost like blow by blow.
Which one is more reliable, the Bible or the Hadiths? Which one is the true biography? Which one can you read and know that it's the truth? The Gospels or the biographies found in the Hadiths about Muhammad? Where do these biographies of Muhammad come from? Can you trust them? What about the biographies of Jesus, the 4 Gospels that are found in the New Testament? Can you rely on them? Which one should you trust? Let's look at the Gospels. If you believe that the Gospels are reliable, you must come to the conclusion that Jesus is the divine Son of God who died on a cross for the sins of man and rose again from the dead. That's what the Gospels teach about Jesus. So if the Gospels are reliable, that is the conclusion you must come to. Now let me define reliable when it comes to the biographies of Jesus and Muhammad. Reliable means simply that a source is in good position to know if something happened or not. And the best reliability that we have when it comes to looking back at biographies in history is eyewitnesses and people who get information from eyewitnesses. That is the most reliable source that you can have for an event. And when it comes to the Gospels, dear Muslims, despite what you have been taught, there is not a copy anywhere on the planet that has the title in the Gospels that doesn't say Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. I'm going to say that again. There are no copies, manuscripts anywhere that have the titles that do not have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John assigned to the proper gospel. There is no evidence at all that exists to back up the claim that the titles were inserted at a later time. It doesn't exist. Again, because every single manuscript that has a title in it has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No anonymous copies exist anywhere. The reason why they have titles is simple. There's more than one gospel. Matthew wrote one, Mark wrote one, Luke wrote one, and John wrote one. There is zero evidence of any of the church fathers arguing over who wrote these gospels. They were universally accepted as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The authors' names are not found in the text. It's true that, like the Gospel of Matthew does not start off by saying, "Hello, my name is Matthew, and this is my gospel." But that's not unusual for biographies. In fact, many historical works like Tacitus and Plutarch are identified as written by Tacitus and Plutarch from external sources. There is no manuscripts anywhere on the planet that don't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John when they have titles to them. There are no anonymous copies that exist. And Matthew was attested by Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. These are church fathers. And Mark, Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria. And Luke, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen. And John, Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. They were not pulling from one source. In other words, there's not one location that wrote these Gospels anonymously and then later on the names were tacked on. Because early on, the 4 corners of the Roman Empire recognized these Gospels as written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These names that I gave you, there were bishops in Turkey, there were bishops in Africa, there were bishops in Europe, and there were bishops all the way in France that recognized this is the 4 corners of the Roman Empire early on, recognized exactly who wrote these Gospels. So there is no time allowed for fake copies to be made and then later on anonymous names be written in, because the church would have recognized it. As soon as Matthew was circulated, the churches knew exactly who wrote it. Same for Mark, Luke, and John. As soon as those Gospels, were sent out to the churches, they knew exactly who wrote them right off the bat. Now let's take a look at some of these church fathers. Papias knew the Apostle John, and Papias was around in the 1st century. Okay, so Papias was a disciple of the Apostle John, and he was in great position to know who wrote the 4 Gospels. He knew. And Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. So we have the chain just from John to Polycarp to Irenaeus that names all 4 Gospels as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So these were guys who were in position to know who wrote these Gospels. They were definitely not anonymous. And Justin Martyr, who was born in the 1st century, recognized that there were 4 Gospels that were written, 2 by apostles and 2 that followed apostles. And guess what? Matthew and John were apostles, and Mark and Luke were followers of apostles. Mark gets his information for his gospel from the apostle Peter, and Luke gets his information for his gospel from the apostle Paul. Now, Islam claims that these 4 Gospels are forgeries, but we just witnessed the historical facts that decimate this argument. They were not forgeries. And in fact, if they were forgeries, let's just ask this question. If they were forgeries, why pick Matthew to write his gospel? If they were making this up, if this was all a lie and a big hoax, and some anonymous person wrote these Gospels and then later on somebody attached a name to it, why pick Matthew? Because Matthew's Gospel is written mainly for a Jewish audience. And Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman government who collected taxes from his Jewish neighbors. So tax collectors were hated. So why in the world would they put Matthew as one of the gospel writers? And then why pick 2 obscure people like Mark and Luke? Mark is mentioned in the New Testament and Luke is mentioned in the New Testament, but they're minor players. If the church were making forgeries, they would not pick Mark and Luke, 2 obscure people in the New Testament, as writers of a gospel. And all 4 Gospels were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses that witnessed Jesus and his ministry and his resurrection. I'll say that again. All 4 Gospels, regardless of what you read on the internet and read from Myth Vision and anybody else on YouTube, the 4 Gospels, the majority of scholarship says they were written in the 1st century, and all 4 Gospels were written in the lifetime of the apostles. And the apostles witnessed these things. Matthew and John were apostles. They witnessed Jesus and his ministry. They witnessed his resurrection. They witnessed his teaching, all of it. They were there from the beginning to the end. And Mark and Luke got their information from eyewitnesses. Luke, obviously, in his meticulous gospel, gets his historical information, you can tell by reading it, from different eyewitness testimonies, different eyewitness sources. And Mark gets his information from the apostle Peter. This is well attested to within the early church, that Mark's gospel was Peter's eyewitness testimony. So we have the Gospels having eyewitness testimony, the biographies of Jesus, eyewitness testimony, and those who got testimony from the eyewitnesses. That is great. that is really good for historical references to say if something is reliable or not. Remember, reliability is when a good source who is in good position to know if something happened or not. Okay, that's what reliable is. When there's a source that is in good position to know if an event happened or not, and the best way you can do that is have eyewitnesses or someone receiving information from eyewitnesses. And that is the four Gospels. Now let's look at the biographies of Muhammad, who are found in the Hadiths. Are these reliable? Do these sources come from eyewitnesses? Are these sources written by eyewitnesses? Are these biographies written by people who got eyewitness testimony from the people who saw things happen firsthand? Well, the first biography that is written about Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq, is written over 100 years after Muhammad. And keep in mind, a lot of Muslims don't even regard that as an authoritative hadith. But the two biographies that Islam goes to has their what they consider their best sources is Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. And both of these biographies were written over 200 years after Muhammad. You heard me. These biographies of Muhammad were written 200 years after he lived. The biographies of Jesus were written by eyewitnesses and those who got their information from eyewitnesses. And the reason why these biographies of Muhammad were written 200 years afterwards is because there are so many false stories circulating around about Muhammad. Now, people, Muslims, if stories were circulating around 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad, think of all the false stories that were being told about Muhammad for 200 years before his biographies were written. But when it comes to Jesus' biographies, they were written by eyewitnesses and those who got their testimony from eyewitnesses. Within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, all four Gospels were written in the 1st century. So are Muhammad's biographies reliable? Remember, reliability is when someone is in good position to know if something is true or not. And the best sources you can have are eyewitnesses and those who get their testimony from eyewitnesses. And Muhammad's biographies don't match up with any of that criteria. None. So you cannot rely on biographies that were written 200 plus years after the fact. Did you know there is a Muslim scholar who looked at all of this information about the biographies of Muhammad and their unreliability? This is a Muslim scholar, and he makes the claim that Muhammad never existed. That's Muhammad Sven Kalish. Look him up. You'll see that this Muslim scholar makes the claim that Muhammad never lived. He's a total fabrication. So just judging by the historical evidence, the Gospels are definitely reliable because they were written by eyewitnesses and people who got the eyewitness testimony from the eyewitnesses. This is who wrote the four Gospels, the biographies of Jesus. They are definitely reliable. And Muhammad's are unreliable. They were written by people that never knew Muhammad, never met Muhammad's followers. They were way off, over 200 years away from the action of Muhammad's life. So, remember, if the Gospels are reliable, you must come to the conclusion that Jesus is God in the flesh, that he died on the cross for your sin and rose from the dead, and Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that's what the Gospels teach about Jesus. And you can't rely on biographies that were written 200 years out from Muhammad. The Gospels are reliable. The Hadiths that talk about the biography of Muhammad are not. So what you need to do, dear Muslim, is leave Islam behind and put your trust and faith in Jesus Christ, who died for your sin and rose from the dead. You can rely on this gospel message. Trust in Him today.